The voice was deep and steady, cutting through the mocking laughter like a knife through silence. Margaret, still on the ground, squinted through blurry vision to see who had spoken. The crowd parted slowly, revealing a tall figure stepping forward. He was a stranger to most in Willow Creek, but his presence demanded attention. He was built like an oak tree, broad-shouldered, strong, with a quiet intensity in his eyes that spoke of experience, perhaps hardship. He wore a simple leather jacket, the kind that had seen its fair share of battles, and his hair, streaked with silver, suggested a man who had lived through enough to know when things were about to turn ugly. Jax's arrogant grin faltered as he turned to face the newcomer. "Who the hell are you?" he sneered, clearly unimpressed. His gang shifted uneasily, sensing a change in the air. They had never seen anyone confront Jax before, not like this. The stranger didn't flinch. His calm gaze rested on Margaret for a moment, as if silently assessing her condition, then returned to Jax with a cold focus. "I said, that's enough," he repeated, his voice as calm as it was authoritative. Margaret, slowly picking herself up from the ground, could feel the tension rising. Her heart was still racing, but there was something about this man, something that made her feel for the first time since this terrifying encounter began that she wasn't alone. Jax, feeling the eyes of his gang on him, puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim control. He revved his bike, the loud growl of the engine meant to intimidate, but the stranger didn't so much as blink. "You want a piece of this, old man?" Jax taunted, his bravado rising again. "Why don't you mind your own business before you regret it?" The man took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "Seems like you're the one who's going to regret it if you don't leave now," he said, his tone deadly calm. His eyes bore into Jax's, unyielding, unwavering. For a moment, the street was still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the townsfolk watched in quiet awe. Margaret, standing now, brushed the dirt from her clothes and took a deep breath. She had taught the children of Willow Creek the importance of standing up for what was right, but in this moment she saw it being put into action in a way she had never imagined. Jax's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you can scare me, old man? I run this town now." He turned to his gang, expecting their support, but something was different this time. The confidence in their smirks wavered as they exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to easy targets, people too scared to fight back. But this man, something about him felt dangerous. The stranger stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Jax's. "You don't run anything," he said quietly, "but if you want to see what happens when you push the wrong people, keep going." Jax's hand tightened on the throttle, his anger boiling over. He couldn't let this go, not in front of his gang, not in front of the town. With a snarl he lunged forward, reaching for the stranger's jacket. But he never made it. With lightning speed the stranger moved, his hand catching Jax's wrist mid-swing. In one swift motion he twisted Jax's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees with a sharp cry of pain. The crowd gasped, the bikers froze. Jax, the feared leader of the gang, was on the ground, powerless. The stranger leaned down, his voice low but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Leave this town. Now. And don't come back." Jax, gritting his teeth in pain, tried to resist, but the stranger's grip was unrelenting. "You don't know who you're messing with," Jax hissed, his arrogance replaced by desperation. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," the stranger replied, his voice calm as ever. "A bully who's about to learn a hard lesson." With one last twist, the stranger released Jax, who scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist. Humiliated and furious, Jax glanced at his gang, but none of them moved to back him up. They were stunned, unsure of what to do. "Let's get out of here," Jax growled, his voice filled with venom. "This town ain't worth it." He spat on the ground before storming off to his bike. His gang, now silent and shaken, followed him, casting uneasy looks at the stranger as they revved their engines and roared out of town. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the tension in the air lifted. The townsfolk began to murmur, still processing what they had just witnessed. Margaret, her heart still pounding, approached the stranger. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The man turned to her, his expression softening. "No need to thank me," he said. "People like that only have power if no one stands up to them." Margaret nodded, her respect for the stranger growing. "You seem to know a lot about standing up to people like that." He smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind his eyes. "Let's just say I've seen my fair share of bullies." He glanced down the road where the bikers had disappeared. "But you were brave, standing up to them like that. You didn't back down." Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell within her. "I've spent my whole life teaching kids to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is. I couldn't let them think that bullies like Jax are invincible." The stranger nodded. "You're a good teacher." He paused for a moment, then added, "If more people were like you, this world would be a better place." Margaret chuckled, touched by the compliment. "I think you had a hand in making this place better today, too." As the two stood there, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the hills, the small town of Willow Creek felt a little safer, a little stronger. And while Margaret didn't know the stranger's name, she knew one thing for certain: kindness, courage, and standing up for what's right could change the world, one small town at a time. As Robert and Margaret walked away from the scene, the town's quiet resumed. But it was different now, charged with a new energy, a sense of restored dignity that hadn't been felt in Willow Creek for some time. The townspeople exchanged glances, murmurs of admiration and disbelief rippling through the crowd. It was rare to witness such a display of strength and resilience, especially from someone like Robert, who had lived so modestly on the outskirts of town, keeping to himself after years of service. Margaret, still shaken but comforted by her brother's steady presence, squeezed his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Robert nodded, saying nothing, his expression softening as he glanced at her. Despite his stoic exterior, he had always been protective of his younger sister. They had been through a lot together, losing their parents at a young age, facing hardships that could have torn them apart, but they had always leaned on one another. A hard today had only strengthened that bond. As they turned onto a quiet street, leaving the scene behind them, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on the events that had unfolded. She had faced bullies before, but not like this. Jax and his gang weren't just troublemakers, they embodied the fear that had gripped the town recently, a fear that had silenced so many. But seeing Robert stand up to them, so calm and unshaken, reminded her of the power of resolve, the power of standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. Back at the diner, the tension slowly dissolved as people began to disperse. Yet, the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. The regulars, who had watched in awe, now buzzed with conversation, recounting the details as if they were part of something far greater than themselves. The diner's owner, a middle-aged man named Sam, wiped his brow, still in disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day someone took down Jax like that," he muttered, shaking his head. It wasn't long before word spread throughout the town. By the next morning, everyone from the cafe regulars to the high school students had heard the story. Willow Creek had always been a tight-knit community, but for the past few months the bikers' reign of intimidation had driven a wedge between the people. Fear had a way of isolating even the closest of communities. But now there was a renewed sense of togetherness, a shared pride in what had transpired. Margaret and Robert's simple act of courage inspired others. Neighbors who had once avoided each other began to talk again, checking in on one another, walking down Main Street with a newfound sense of safety. The local sheriff, who had been overwhelmed and unsure of how to deal with the bikers, found himself fielding questions from the press as news of the incident spread to neighboring towns. But to Robert, it was nothing extraordinary. He didn't see himself as a hero, and when people tried to thank him or offer praise, he would simply wave them off. Just doing what anyone should have done, he'd say. Yet deep down, even he knew that it wasn't something everyone would have done. Fear has a way of paralyzing people, and he had seen it time and time again, both in combat and back home. The courage to act wasn't about fearlessness, it was about pushing forward in spite of it. Margaret, too, felt the weight of the event in the days that followed. Her students, both past and present, began to visit her at home, sharing stories of how her teachings had shaped their lives. Many of them hadn't forgotten the lessons she instilled in them, the importance of respect, standing up for others, and showing kindness, even in the face of adversity. In a way, what had happened with Jax was a real-world manifestation of everything she had tried to impart over the years. The experience had left her shaken, yes, but also more resolute than ever in her belief that even the smallest acts of defiance against wrong could ripple out and change lives. As for Jax and his gang, they were never seen in Willow Creek again. Rumor had it they had moved on to another town, but this time people weren't as afraid to stand up to them. It was as if the news of their defeat had stripped them of their power, their intimidation tactics no longer holding the same weight. They had become the subject of local gossip, the once feared reputation, now reduced to little more than a cautionary tale. Robert's actions became a legend in Willow Creek, something people would talk about for years. But in the quiet of his home, he remained the same man he had always been, humble, quiet, and fiercely protective of his family. For him, that day was not about heroism. It was about doing what needed to be done. It was about love, honor, and the simple fact that bullies, no matter how intimidating they seemed, could be defeated by those who stood strong. And so life in Willow Creek returned to normal, but with a newfound strength in the hearts of its people. The town had always been peaceful, but now it was something more. It was a place where people had learned that courage didn't always come from the young or the strong. Sometimes it came from a retired schoolteacher and her brother, quietly walking the streets they had always called home. In the days that followed, Willow Creek reflected on Robert's quiet act of courage. The lesson wasn't just about standing up to bullies, but about the true meaning of strength. Real courage, they realized, isn't loud or showy. It's knowing when to act, even in the face of fear. Robert taught them that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come from those you least expect, and that standing up for what's right doesn't require power, but heart. In the end, the town learned that true strength lies in quiet determination and a willingness to protect others, no matter the cost. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to William's Wisdom Stories for more powerful tales of courage and kindness. Let's spread the message that standing up for what's right, even in the face of fear, can change everything. What act of bravery has inspired you? Share your thoughts in the comments below.